plays. Carlsen was playing white here, and he starts off with the Jobava London System, which is actually quite trendy nowadays, because white has this very unpleasant threat of knight to b5. And in the game, black was cautious and played a6 himself, but just for a second I'll show you the main trap of this opening. In case black plays some trivial moves such as knight to c6, there is knight to b5, and all of a sudden black is already done. There is no way to defend this pawn. There is even a funny variation here, which I'm going to share with you real quick. If black tries e5 to block the diagonal for a bishop, then you take that pawn, attack their knight, and after it goes, all of a sudden you pull off this queen sacrifice out of nowhere, and then you play knight takes c7, this octopus attack, and then you take it back, and black is totally destroyed. Back to the game, black knew the trap and played pawn a6 to stop the knight from jumping forward. By the way, I don't know who the black player is, it was an online blitz game, but nevertheless, the game is super instructive and is gonna blow your mind. Here white played initially pawn e3, pawn e6, standard stuff, and then all of a sudden Carlsen played pawn to g4. And that is the first moment which I would like to highlight, because people often ask me this question, like, why do grandmasters say that you need to develop in an opening, but then they don't, right? So what is the purpose? Well, the purpose of this move is to play g5 and to sort of undevelop this knight from f6, to kick it back. And that is already the first rule. In an opening, you may either develop your pieces or hinder opponent's development. These both ideas are equally good. In other words, white can sort of wants to undevelop this knight from f6, and on the next turn after black played c5, now g5 kicks this knight away, and after it goes back to d7, now this knight is passive, it also blocks the other pieces of black so that they can't move freely, and therefore, yes, white did not develop his own pieces, but he sort of undeveloped this knight from f6. Now, here white continues with h4, another paradoxical move, because initially it looks like, hey, you've got most of your pieces stuck on their starting positions, and instead you're just marching these two pawns forward, violating all classical opening rules. But again, it's kind of continuation of the same plan, and the nice thing about pushing these side pawns forward is that they activate and therefore develop your rook, even though the rook has never moved in this game, but by pushing these pawns forward, you actually involve the rook into play. So here black played knight c6, and after knight to f3, bishop e7, so far so good, white goes h5. In the future, he wants to possibly keep pushing one of these pawns forward, and the rook is going to become active on its starting position. And here comes the second super instructive moment, probably the most common mistake of all. Black played pawn takes d4. And at first you may be wondering, hey, that's just an exchange, right? How can you say that it is, a mistake? Black doesn't lose anything. Well, of course, black is not going to be checkmated right there, but it is a positional error which makes white's position better. If you've been following this channel for some time, you probably heard me saying to take is a mistake, and that is indeed true. Now, what it means is you should avoid unmotivated exchanges, meaning an exchange which does not give you anything specific, where it's just an exchange for the sake of an exchange. And the problem with those exchanges is that they help your opponent. In this case, it will help white to advance forward either a pawn or a knight, which is good in both cases. By the way, the same rule applies for white. Notice that if white, let's say, I'll just take it back, let's say if white at some point took on c5, that would also be the same mistake, because it would allow black to activate one of his pieces, and white sort of helped that. Therefore, you don't want that. Plus, in this position, after black took on d4, also notice that black limited his own options, because with a pawn on c5, the pawn can either take or can push forward, and it is going to happen on black's turns. Black can decide when to take or not to take, or to push it forward, and white has to take that into account. For example, I can't, develop the bishop easily because black can always play c4 and kick it away, right? So this exchange on d4 is a very common error, and of course it's a universal rule. It's going to be applied to any other position as well. Now here black plays b5, and Carlsen noticed that the pawn is going to be going forward to b4, and this knight will need to move somewhere. That is the third super important rule. It's very natural for us to be focused on our own plans. So while playing, you start thinking, okay, so I'm going to attack here, I'm going to push this pawn, I'm going to do something, I'm going to activate the rook, checkmate him, etc, etc. But it has this tunnel vision error that you're totally ignoring your opponent, who has an equal say in the chess game, right? So here Carlsen realized that black will play b4, and then this knight will need to move. And where will the knight go? Well, you don't want to undevelop it back. You could possibly move it to b4 in that case, but a knight on the rim is dim. Generally speaking, you wish to keep your pieces closer to the middle of the board, and if the knight goes back to e2, it's going to block the bishop. And he realized that and developed the bishop, so that this time, once black played b4, now he can conveniently relocate the knight to e2, but it no longer blocks the bishop from its starting position, and all these pieces are standing pretty harmoniously. Black played knight b6. Now, you can actually try to apply the rules that you're learning straight away. Now, what does black want? Let's ask ourselves this question once again. So once your opponent played a move, take a second to ask yourself what was the point of that move? What is he going to do next? Now, black just moved the knight to b6, and probably he wants to bring it somewhere here. And if you ignore that and don't pay attention, and let's say you think, okay, what do I want to do here? Maybe I want to castle queenside because my kingside is already super exposed. So maybe I want to play here and then castle queenside. It's a great plan in general. This is actually what Carlsen did later. But that ignored the fact that your opponent also is going to do something. And here black would play knight c4, threaten from here this queen, the pawn, and if you trade off, now black's got a more active queen, this long diagonal for the bishop. If you ever castle there, it's going to be extremely dangerous, because he can then push one of his central pawns forward and open up your king. So now you're in trouble, just because you didn't ask yourself what was the idea of my opponent. Back to the game, Carlsen noticed that black wants to advance the knight and played b3 to take that square away. At this point, black went bishop to d6. And I want to also talk about that, because as a chess coach, I've been coaching for the last 15 years, and I've seen this stuff over and over and over again, and that's why I'm so excited to share these ideas with you, because I think that if you just learn a couple of these little tweaks, it's going to be tremendously helpful. Now, bishop d6, what do you think about that move? Well, it is just one of many moves that black could possibly play, right? Now, but what's wrong with that move? Well, in chess, theoretically, in most of positions, there are plenty of moves that you can play, right? You can move one of the pieces that you have many of them, you can move them anywhere, right? So you have like 10 of different options that you can choose from. So how do you decide which move is the best? Well, you need to have a guideline. And in an opening, the guideline is to develop your pieces and castle, like the first tasks that you need to think of. And therefore, anything else that doesn't pursue these goals should be put further down in the list, and you should not do that. So bishop d6, I understand black wanting to do something. He wanted to maybe trade off this active bishop. Maybe black didn't like the fact that this bishop is taking away some squares from black. Like maybe they wanted to influence the center. Like it all makes some sense, but it's just not the most important thing. Because all you gotta be thinking about is how to castle, how to develop my pieces. Currently this light square bishop is not yet developed, so you could develop it somehow, right? That's only two things that you should be thinking about, and anything else is wrong. And bishop d6 in itself may not seem like a big error, but in reality it's just, you know, black does not adhere strictly to a plan. Alright, should white take here on d6 or not? Well, we're testing your knowledge, right? To take is a mistake. You shouldn't. It would only help black to advance his queen. So it's a common example of the same thing. Therefore, Carlsen played queen d2, inviting black to make this mistake. So if black captures on f4, that will help white to advance forward, either his knight or queen. In both cases, good for white. Now, black played queen c7. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe he's trying to line up against this bishop, but it's already guarded. And again, you can see that black is probably a strong player. He plays like quite decent moves and he's challenging Carlsen, but in reality, he's making all these fairly common errors. So again, queen c7, not a bad move in itself, but does not follow the main idea. Black needs to develop or castle one of these two, all right? After queen c7, white castles queenside. Now white actually completed his development successfully. Black played a5, trying to attack there on the queen side. White played king b1, prophylactic move. By the way, a nice thing about a queenside castling in general is that you have your rook active straight away once you castled queenside, which is not the case when you castled kingside, because in that case your rook is stuck behind the pawn. But your king is not as safe when you castle queenside because it does not stand right here, right behind these three pawns. So king b1 is a very common prophylactic move once you castle queenside, and in this particular case it makes even more sense because after a4 black wants to attack there, therefore the white king is already taking part in self-defense. Alright, let's move on to the next thing. The next idea, which I love so much and which I think is totally overlooked. Whenever I look at games of amateur players versus games of like title players, there is one thing which always is absolutely obvious. Strong players keep their pieces well connected, harmonious, so that they stand close, they defend each other. Like if you look at Carlsen's position right here, you can see that all these pieces are standing close to each other, they all are defending each other. Also, the both rooks are eyeing each other and also supporting each other. And it's easy to relocate white's pieces from one side of the board to the other one. Now, if you look at the black's position from, the same perspective, you can see that this rook is kind of stuck right here in the corner, and it's pretty hard to somehow bring it closer to other pieces because there are many other pieces which are standing in the way. This bishop on c8 is undeveloped, the rook on a8 is undeveloped, so you can see that a bunch of pieces are standing there doing nothing, and they're not connected, and they're not also pursuing any common goal. And this is the same thing that I can see over and over again while looking at the games of amateur players. They are pursuing certain specific ideas, but they're lacking this general idea that you just need to put your pieces connected. And one of the actionable tips to keep in mind is that once you completed your development in an opening, you need to be sure that your rooks are connected, that they look at each other. In other words, you castled, you developed your minor pieces, and that automatically creates the situation where your rooks are connected. And only then you can say that, okay, my opening is completed, and now I can start playing the middle game plan, which is usually to attack. And that's what Carlsen does. He goes pawn g6. Now black trades on b3. That's another instructive moment here. How do you recapture? With this pawn or with the other one? Now, what I love about this game is that pretty much all the moves of Carlsen are very instructive and illustrate certain rules. Now, in general, in chess, there is a rule which states that you need to take towards the center. In this case, it would be pawn takes b3 because this pawn is on the side. You wish to bring it closer to the center. But in this particular case, when your king is castled queenside, you do not want to do that because that move would be a big blunder. It would open up the a file for black to attack, and black can just play queen a7 and then checkmate white right on the next turn. So that would be a big blunder. Therefore, if your king stands there, then it's better to take like this, keeping the a file closed so that he can easily checkmate you in the future, you know. And then black played bishop a6. Now, recollecting one of the previous rules we talked about, once your opponent played a move, you gotta ask yourself, what does he want? Right? What's the idea of this move? Well, quite clearly he wants to take right here on d3. And you would need to recapture, which would leave this other bishop undefended. So you see, it's really important. It's never too late to mess up. If I played any, like, careless move such as this one, black would indeed execute this thing, and after the trade, now black is up a piece, white lost the bishop, and now black is winning, despite all previous mistakes. Back to the game, Carlsen noticed the threat and took on a6 himself. And at this point, let me answer another common question that students ask me. Igor, you've just said that to take is a mistake, but sometimes in chess you do need to take. Well, of course, you're absolutely right. What I'm saying here with that rule to take is a mistake is that you should avoid unmotivated exchanges when you don't get anything out of it. For example, if white trades on d6, it would be an unmotivated exchange. You don't have any specific idea behind that. It is just an exchange of a bishop for a bishop, and there is nothing else behind that. But in this case, there is a specific reason for white to capture this bishop. If you don't do that, as we discussed, black will take here, and then will win the other bishop. Of course, we don't want that. That is why white takes. There is a specific reason. He wants to avoid that unfavorable variation, and he doesn't want to defend somehow, so that he doesn't have to slow down his attack. And after the trade, he then played h6. Quite interesting move, aiming to totally disrupt black's kingside. Black tried to somehow simplify matters by taking on f4, thinking that it attacks the queen and gives black a tempo, but Carlsen ignored that and played pawn takes g7, because he believes in reincarnation. He knows that if the queen dies, she's gonna reborn right then. Black tried to remove the rook, but then Carlsen once again ignored this threat and just recaptured on h7 with the same idea. And even though at this point it looks quite logical, but in general it is quite mind-boggling that in the middle of an intense battle, somehow Carlsen managed to bring these two pawns all across the board to the 7th rank. But that's not the end of the story, because now after black took on d2, white took this rook and promoted the other queen with a check, and after the king moves, white then grabs the other pawn with a check, and on the next move he can then promote this pawn just as well. So not only he brought these pawns all across the board all the way up to the 8th rank, but he actually promoted both of them. And at this point black resigned because white is up a queen and there are way too many threats for black to handle.